Welcome everybody. I'm Sarah Lee. I'm one of the directors of Lawrence Dean Recruitment, and we are partnering with Dr. Pete Jones to run this morning's session on unconscious bias. To give you a bit of background for those of you that don't know us, so we are an independent recruitment company. We're based in Stevenage. We recruit throughout Hertfordshire, both temporary and permanent roles, and we focus on the supply of customer service, business support, human resources, sales, marketing and finance people. We've partnered on this topic with Dr. Pete Jones just because it's really relevant, really current right now. So this morning's session is really focused on unconscious bias, but from an HR and recruitment perspective rather than anything else. Obviously, it's a huge topic, but this is going to be focused on that. The session this morning should last for around an hour. After we've completed, you'll get an email from me. Pete has kindly offered that anyone that has attended the webinar this morning can undergo free bias testing. So he has a platform that he has created, and so you'll get an email with a link. It's completely confidential. It's not shared with anyone else. You can use your personal email address. It doesn't have to be connected to your company, but it can really help, I suppose, improve your awareness for your own self-development on your views around the topic. So that will follow through after this morning's session. Other than that, in terms of the session, if you've got any questions, we're going to go through questions at the end. I would ask, if possible, for you to use the question and answer function, the Q&A down the bottom, as opposed to chat. It just means it's a bit easier for me to manage, and it means it will run a bit smoother. So if you could use the Q&A function for any questions that you've got. Without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Pete. He's a real subject matter expert on this topic, and he's going to be facilitating today's session. So over to you, Pete.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, so I'm Pete Jones, Sharp Professional Chartered Psychologist. I think, as Sarah said, I spend my life delivering unconscious bias training and testing and research and consultancy. So I run quite a few of these webinars, and I use some of the facilities that we have within Zoom. So I use the polling facility. You're not going to worry too much about that. It'll pop up on the screen when we come. So there's a couple of points where I'll hop off and ask you for your opinions. There's also one point where we'll use the chat facility just to get your opinion on something. So I will be using that, and I'll point in the direction. If you look, I think at the bottom of the screen, you'll see the chat box right next to the share screen button. So without taking any further, and I'll talk a little bit about bias test as we go through, by the way. I'll just share with you, if I may, the slide deck for this morning. So hopefully now you can see the first slide. So this session then has got a number of objectives. The first one is to talk about the underpinning principles of implicit bias. So you'll hear me talk about implicit bias. Unconscious bias is the terminology that's used, I think, quite extensively. Occasionally I'll hear subconscious bias. In all practical senses, they're the same thing. We might be able to technically unpick them, but fundamentally implicit bias is the technical word. Unconscious bias is the one everybody uses. And subconscious bias drives me bonkers. So there we go. So a little bit for the evidence for the impact of that. And I've got quite a bit of material. So one of the ways I'll be using the poll in this is to ask you to focus the time for me. So we've got evidence in lots of areas, but I want you to kind of give me a sense of where you'd like me to spend the time. And then importantly, what can we do about it? It would be remiss of me to use the time up without actually giving you some clues. So I've got some top tips for organizations. And I've got some top personal actions. And there is a handout, by the way, which accompanies this course, and I'll send it to Sarah. She can send it to you. It's creatively called The Nature of Unconscious Bias. So it says, this is what it is, this is how it plays out. And on the flip side are our 9 top tips that every individual can employ to mitigate unconscious bias. And then finally, we've got the piece around question answers at the end. So that's the cunning plan then. And I'll talk a little bit about bias testing to kind of relieve your anxiety about that as we go through. So I'm going to start with a quote. It comes from Professor Trish Devine, who is Professor of Prejudice at Wisconsin University. Trish says there are no bad people, just bad thinking habits. I think she's wrong. I think there are some bad people. I've worked with 1 or 2 over the years. I fear you have as well. But the vast majority of people who come to work to do a great job. They come to make the best decisions they can and to treat people well. But this idea of unconscious bias gets in the way of our best intentions. Trish says unconscious bias is a thinking habit we've learned, and I'll take you through the process by which we've learned our biases, and importantly, which we can unlearn. it's not fixed in stone. The research suggests it actually can be quite malleable and vulnerable to our intervention if we do the right things at the right times. Now, the important thing about it is this, is Trish's work suggests that an hour of unconscious bias training, coupled with some bias testing, which I'll go through in this session, and having some basic cognitive strategies as they appear on the card, over a 12-week period, Trish saw a downward track in the bias test scores. And although knowledge of the basic principles seemed to decay over time, 2 years later, when she revisited some of the people who had that 1 hour, she could still find evidence in their behaviour for a change in the way that they behave. So they were more likely to challenge bias when they saw it in the real world. So it does seem that it's vulnerable to our intervention if we know what to do and when to do it. So I'm going to start this session, if I may, with some maths. I know it's your favourite thing. I simply need you to calculate in your head. You don't need a calculator for this. The answer to this simple mathematical problem. And then I'm going to put a poll up where you can put your answer into the question. I'll actually give you the answer. You just need to choose the right answer from a list. So here we go. So a bat and the ball cost £1.10p. The bat costs £1 more than the ball. So how much does the ball cost? So if I pop up the poll, I'm actually going to give you the answers to some of this. So here they go. I'll give you the options. So the first option is doesn't cost anything. It's a freebie. The next one is only cost a penny. The next one it costs 5p, 9p, 10p. Or have you got another amount in mind? So have a vote if you would. And when at least half of you have voted, I will reveal the results of that poll. Until you've all voted, by the way, or most of you have voted, we'll just be sat here gazing at the screen. So don't be shy and coming forward and giving your views on it. We're 2/3 the way there. That's quite good, isn't it? A couple of more seconds and then I'll share the results of that poll with you. So here we go then. So almost, I think 30 out of 36 of you, 31 of you have voted, so 32. So let me end the poll then. I'll share the results with you. It's obvious, isn't it, that 81% of people say that the answer is 10p. Some people think it's 5p. There's a few sort of odds around the edge along the way. Okay, so with that in mind then, let me just return to the slide deck if I can, just to sort of talk you through the maths of this. So some of you may have seen it before. It comes from a book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. So Daniel's a psychologist who won the Nobel Prize for Economics a few years ago for applying what people know about how the brain works to how we think about money and how we think about number. Daniel gave that to undergraduates at university. 80% of the undergraduates presented with that problem said that the answer is 10 pence. Because it feels like 10 pence, doesn't it? We take the pound off the pound and 10p answer, we come up with the 10 pence. But it can't possibly be 10 pence. And I'll show you why not. So if it were 10 pence, so the ball's 10 pence and the bat is £1 more than the ball, it says that, doesn't it, in the middle line. So if the ball were 10 pence, that would mean the bat would have to be £1.10 to make it keep that £1 difference between the two. So add the two together, it comes to £1.20. It can't be 10 pence. There is only one right answer, by the way, and I've seen this 1,000 times. I'm sure I've tried every permutation. The only right answer is 5 pence. So a 5 pence ball, the bat is £1 more than the ball, so that means that's £1 and 5 pence. Add the two together and we get the £1 and 10 pence. But it doesn't feel like that to most people. For most people, they do the quick bit of maths and they come up with the 10p answer. So it's not a surprise when people say 10 pence. What surprised Daniel Kahneman was this, that if he didn't say to them, look, it can't possibly be 10 pence. Look, let me show you why it's 5 pence. If he just said, are you sure? Before we move on to the next little conundrum I've got for you, I want you to be sure you've got it right. Spend some time. When you think you've got the answer right for sure, put your hand up and we'll carry on to the next problem. They did. They spent some time, confirmed the answer was 10 pence and carried on. It seems that once we make these apparently quick and easy decisions, we don't seem well equipped to be able to go back and rethink them. They get stuck in the neural pathways of our brain. So what Daniel's actually talking about here is this idea of dual processing, that the brain has got two simultaneous operating systems for processing information, the conscious and the unconscious. And the conscious is that little voice in your head that's saying, gosh, I wish I'd popped to the toilet before this started. I must email that guy later on. I promised him I'd have him that stuff by lunchtime. I must pick up some cat food on the way home tonight. Oh, gracious, I must book the dog in for the vet. Otherwise, that itchy thing will be back by the weekend. So that's the conscious at work. It's the little voice that narrates your life. And it has particular features. So final bit of the maths of the day, I promise. I want you to multiply in your head 42 times 17. So 42 times 17 in your head as fast as you can. I've not got any pictures up for you on this, by the way, but I'm guessing at this moment in time there's a bit of complexity going on there and perplexion at that as well. Because when I ask you to calculate 42 times 17, three things happen that show us how the conscious works. The first one is this. We're often taken back to Mrs. Parker's maths class, and Mrs. Parker taught me to do that big kind of multiplication. You put one number over another number, you multiply the first digit by the second digit, you add a zero, you carry the tens across. It matters not how you were taught to do that kind of maths. What matters most is the fact that it's rule driven. The conscious gets out previously learned rules and it uses them to try and solve new and novel problems. So that's the first feature, rule driven. The second feature of the conscious is it's fairly slow and clunky. It typically takes people about 5 or 10 seconds to get the bat and the ball problem wrong. 42 times 17, which I think is 714 if you're working your way towards it, it takes people about 15 or 20 seconds. It's slow and it's clunky in its operation. And the final feature of the conscious was the look on your faces. Because when I ask people to calculate 42 times 17, something happens. Everything comes to a grinding halt. All of the twiddling of earlobes, the sipping of water, the stroking of air comes to a grinding halt. The looking out the window stops and it's replaced by blank looks. People close their eyes, they gaze off into space, they rub their face. And the reason for that is really, really simple. And that is that the conscious has a limit on the amount of information it can process in any one moment in time. And when it reaches that limit, it stops. And 42 times 17 is about that limit. It's about 40 bits of processing power. And that is all that the conscious has got to bear. If you ask people to calculate 42 times 17 when they're walking on the street, they often have to stop. They can't even swing their arms and legs in unison and calculate 42 times 17 because of this limit on the amount of information the conscious can process. So it's 40 bits of information at any one moment in time. So I'll give you a picture in your head, if I may, of what 40 bits of processing power look like as a 40 millimeter table tennis ball. That's all you've got. And 42 times 17 eats it all up. But we're impressed by the conscious because it does the day job. Problem solving, decision making, planning, all take place in the conscious in tiny slithers of 40 bits after 40 bits after 40 bits. But fundamentally, the conscious is limited resources, it is slow and clunky in its operation, and it is dependent upon learned rules. That's the conscious. Let's talk now about the unconscious, because that's what we're really interested in there. So it's the other side of Daniel Kahneman's two-stage model. So the unconscious is the complete opposite. For start off, it does not have that limit on the amount of information it can process. It can process 200,000 times as much information, 11 million bits compared to the 40 bits of the conscious in any one moment in time. I've done a little bit of maths. It would be a 2.4 meter ping pong ball if it was comparative in size to our standard size table tennis ball. It has got colossal processing power. And it's fast, it's very fast. This is how fast it is. If I slide you into an fMRI brain scanner and flash onto a computer screen in front of you a photograph of someone who does not look like you, they have a different ethnic origin, a different gender, but it also works with things like sexual orientation. And I flash onto the computer screen a photograph of someone who doesn't look like you and wait to see what the fMRI brain scan shows us. And what the fMRI brain scan shows us is this. Somewhere between 30 and 100 milliseconds, so even before the picture can be processed, it takes the brain around about 300 milliseconds to process an image through the optical nerve and for the brain to make sense of it. So if I take it off the screen at, say, 200 milliseconds and say, what did you see? People say nothing. I didn't see anything. There was a flash of light. What the fMRI scan shows is that somewhere between 30 and 100 milliseconds, so before your eyes have even processed and made sense of the image, the unconscious brain has got it. We see an activation, a very ancient part of our brain. It's part of our old reptilian brain from way back in our development. We see that activation in the brain's amygdala. We used to talk about it as the fight or flight response. We now talk about it as the emotional response of the brain. We see that response only for faces that don't look like ours, somewhere between 30 and 100 milliseconds. It's already sending those chemical and electrical messages across the brain for that impulse to become behavior. By the time the conscious finally picks the ball, literally, at about 400 milliseconds, it's too late. The unconscious could have made that decision 10 or 15 times over while your eyes are simply processing the image remarkably fast. But it's the final difference that is critical. It's not it's not data-driven, it's not rule-driven like the conscious, it's intuitively driven. It's the process by which it acquires intuition and uses it for making judgments about people that is critical. So, You can only see the top half of me today, but I've got on the bottom, I've got blue trousers, and I've got a pair of blue shoes with purple laces in them. So the brain is always trying to predict how people might behave. So it looks at my shoes and it says, what kind of person wears purple laces in blue shoes? And it starts to make judgments about the style of my shoes and the shade of the purple that I've chosen, the cleanliness of my shoes and how big the heel is. It's already brought the little ping pong ball, the conscious, to a grinding halt. It can only do 42 times 17, and it's now got 4 or 5 dimensions of my shoes to make a prediction of. And it's not just doing my shoes, it's doing my trousers, my shirt, my accent, my skin tone, my hair, the way that I sit. It's making lots of predictions about me. And it's not just doing me, it's doing you and you and you and you and you. It's doing everybody that it meets. And it's very rapidly processing those images in the blink of an eye. So far, so good. I can now release the resources of the conscious for doing the difficult stuff, problem solving, decision making, planning, and I can leave the unconscious for making all the decisions that it needs to make about people in the blink of an eye with the massive resources of the unconscious. Here's the problem. It uses a process of social categorization. It pigeonholes. It says, I know a little bit about people who wear purple laces in their shoes. I know a little bit about people who wear that kind of shirt, who went to the school that you went to, that got the accent you've got, that went to the university you went to, that live in the part of the city where you live. It thinks it knows a little bit about you. And it starts to socially categorize you, pigeonhole you into pigeonholes for the groups to which you belong. Still, so far, so good. I can now get through my day, let the unconscious take the strain. Here's the problem. In that process of socially categorizing you, it weighs and values. It likes some of those pigeonholes more than others. In 1954, the Gordon Allport, who is the psychologist who started all this work off on prejudice, said that we have a love prejudice. We keep special pigeonholes for people like us, people who look like us, sound like us, share our background, share our interests, and then everybody else gets less positive pigeonhole, and some people actually get negative pigeonholes. So it processes, but it weighs and it values. So let me talk to you then about how it works then in terms of neurology. So every day I go into shiny office blocks, or I did until March of this year when COVID struck. And when I go into the office block, my little ping pong ball's busy. It's thinking, what was the name of the person I was supposed to ask for? Did they say I should go straight to the room, or should I wait in reception? I wonder if they've got somewhere here I can catch some lunch at lunchtime. I must remember to book the dog in for the vet and pick up some cat food on the way home and email that guy at lunchtime. So that's the conscious at work. It's already got, can I do 42 times 17? It's already got half a dozen jobs to do. The unconscious in reception is only doing one job and one job only, and that is looking for patterns. It is a very, very efficient pattern matching machine. And there is a pattern in reception areas pretty much everywhere I go in terms of the receptionists. They share one category with each other about 95% of the time, one pigeonhole with each other. And that pigeonhole is gender. About 95% of the receptionists I come across, and it may differ in your organisation, but typically 95% of receptionists I encounter are female. So let me tell you, my brain deals with that pattern then of female receptionists. You'll hear the neuroscientists, the biologists talk about something based upon Hebbian theory. I have a little phrase, it goes like this: what the brain fires together, the brain wires together. So when the neurons in my brain that have been clustered together to represent receptionists fire because I meet a receptionist, at the same time as the neurons in my brain that have been clustered together to represent woman, because I meet a woman receptionist, when I meet a female receptionist, those neuron sets fire at the same time. And the brain is fundamentally lazy. We talk about it as a miserly brain. Once that pattern of woman receptionist is established, it starts to connect the two together neurologically. It lays a substance called myelin across the neural pathway that makes that connection faster and stronger. And the brain likes fast and strong connections because it's very, very efficient. So once that pattern is established, when I think woman, I make the connection to all of the jobs where I've seen patterns of women performing that kind of work in the past. When I think receptionist, I make the connection to woman. So here's my question for you then, and I'll use the chat facility if I may with this one, if you hop over onto the chat. So here's the question then, and I'll take you onto the next screen for this one, if I can get it to move. There we go. So if I came into your organisation with my big ping pong ball and I dragged it round for a few days, what would be the patterns it would start to wire together about who does what kind of job? So you can take it as your team, or you can broaden it out if you want to. What are the patterns that I might start to wire into my brain when I drag that big ping pong ball around your organisation. While you're finding the chat facility, by the way, and entering up your thoughts into that, I'll share some of the patterns I often see. So I've spoken about receptionists. Van drivers are often male, I have to say. We also have security, often male on occasions. HR, predominantly female in lots of organisations. Yeah, absolutely. So women in the office, that pattern of women in support roles and administration roles is quite strong. Yeah, IT is often a male one, which I'm guessing where the beard thing might come from, but sometimes people talk about hairstyles in the IT team. Yeah, so customer service advisors. So lots of gender patterns here. Yeah, male senior managers, that's another pattern you see pretty much everywhere you go. Men in engineering is an interesting one, actually. 86% of engineers, I do some sessions at the University of Sheffield Engineering Department, 86% of engineers are male. Yeah, I think you're getting the feel for it now that these patterns are there. There's lots of gender patterns about, but there are other patterns as well. It's not just about gender and ethnicity. So, for example, in fact, I'm going to think of one now. When I go into the Bank of England, there's an awful lot of black people as cleaners in that organisation. So it wouldn't be a surprise if you start to wire black cleaner. Go into the canteen and there's an awful lot of women from Eastern Europe. So woman, canteen or cafeteria, I think they probably call it. East European canteen. The way we dress, so the way that we look, sometimes even personality. I'll give you an example. One organisation I work with, they've got offices in Manchester and London, and they do very much the same work in both offices. But if I go into the office in London, it's staffed almost entirely by, and I'll use the words carefully, comfortably dressed middle-aged women. And you can hear a pin drop in that office. It's really, really quiet, considering it's a large open plan office. If I go into their offices in Manchester, it's bedlam. There's chaos. There's people in with green hair, in shorts in January, in flip-flops in the middle of winter. They're shouting across the office. Nowhere did it say, oh, introverts, London office, extroverts, Manchester office. But once we start to establish these patterns, we start to see them as the basis for making judgments about what kind of people fit in that organisation. So the first source then of these super fast connections, which we use for making judgments about people, are our experiences, the patterns to which we are exposed. The second source then is the media. So what do we see on Facebook? What do we see on the sides of buses? What do we see in the TV advertisements? Unilever, who own brands such as Palmolive and Dove and Marmite, 95% of Unilever ads show women in particular roles: cooking, cleaning, ironing. My favourite ad, by the way, I always like to watch the vacuum cleaner ads, because if there's a vacuum cleaner ad, if there's stuff to be explained, it's a man does the explaining. If it's a bit about actually showing you how it works, it tends to be a woman actually using the piece of equipment. And if you look at the way that men, for example, in those kind of advertisements appear, they're always in a rather foolish role. There's kind of Barry from the Sillet Bang ads, or One Sheet. You don't see many men in those particular advertisements. So while we're sat in front of Coronation Street in the break thinking, oh, I'll have a cup of coffee with a biscuit now, the unconscious keeps on wiring those patterns into our brain. We don't have to attend to them. We can be thinking about other stuff. The unconscious is constantly attending to those patterns. And the final source is culture. What do the people that you love, care for, and respect say about groups in society? What do we get from the ether, from society, about who the valued and less valued groups are? Who've got the best pigeonholes? Who've got the less good pigeonholes? What do they say about people with disabilities? What do they say about asylum seekers? What does society tell us about former army personnel? All of the time, culture, media, and experience create these unique neural pathways, which we use for making all of the predictions about people, in particular, and I'll go through the conditions when we're more likely to do it, when the little ping pong ball is busy doing other stuff. So, I've got no names on screen, by the way, but I'm rather hoping that we don't have anybody called Maisie from Edinburgh here. If we do, hello Maisie, I've spoken to her before. If you've not come across the idea of bias testing, Sarah said we're going to give you. We use a test creatively called bias test, but in actual fact, it's based on the original Harvard implicit association test. So don't believe the hype you see about the Harvard IAT. It is not the only test about. We do have a more reliable more robust and behaviourally anchored version that we use. So if you've not come across this test, they're called implicit association tests, developed by Harvard in 1998. The way they work is really, really simple. They throw words and pictures at you on a computer screen, and what they ask you to do is they ask you to sort the words and pictures according to some rules, and they give you the rules. So let's take a gender test. It says, if a female picture appears on the screen, hit the left key, sort them on the left-hand side. If a male picture appears on the screen, hit the right key, sort them on the right-hand side. Even I can do that. It then starts to mix words in between the pictures, and they're good words, good pigeonholes: talented, competent, able, important, intelligent, or bad pigeonholes: useless, incompetent, stupid, and worthless. And all you have to do is to sort the words according to a rule. It gives you the rule. It says if it's a good word, hit the left key, sort them with the women. If it's a bad word, hit the right key, sort them with the men. So you're presented with these rapidly appearing words and pictures, and all you have to do is sort according to the rules. When you've done about 150 of those sorts, it stops. And it changes the sorting rule. Now, it wants you to sort the good words with the men and the bad words with the women. Because if you have those super fast connections in your head between a particular group, men or women, and good or bad pigeonholes, it interferes with your ability to sort. You wanted to put it over here because the rule told you to, but the big ping pong ball is faster and stronger, and it wants you to put it over there because it has a strong association over there. So while you're correcting for that, it slows you down, it causes you to make mistakes. Sometimes it speeds you up. If you have a strong association and it's sorting in accordance with the rules, you make a very quick decision. So it's got a little algorithm in the background, and what it does, it compares the two halves of the test, and it wants to know, where do they slow down? Where do they speed up? Where do they make mistakes? Because if you have those super fast connections, it interferes with your ability to sort. There's a little algorithm in the background that says, how well does this profile of where they slow down and when they speed up and when they make mistakes predict the likelihood that they will let these super fast connections impinge on their behavior? Of all the people we've ever tested in the UK, and it's over 200,000 tests we've administered now in the UK, only one person, her name is Maisie, we think she lives in Edinburgh, has ever come back with a full set of low scores, suggesting she doesn't have any biases. That's not to say she's completely devoid of bias. She might lean this way a little bit. She might lean in favour of that group a little bit, but she does not lean so far in one direction or the other direction that it impinges on her behaviour. She is unique. The closest he ever came, I've been saying this for about 4 years now, by the way, but we actually came across a guy about 3 weeks ago in a manufacturing company who actually managed 10 consecutive low scores. So age, disability, ethnicity, body height, body weight, nationality, sexual orientation, test after test after test. Maisie got a low score, somewhere in the middle. The guy got 10 low scores. Nobody's ever come close. I think the closest to those two was 8 about 4 years ago in Sheffield. Everybody else who's taken more than 5 or 6 of those tests has always come back with a peak or a trough in their data, suggesting that they do have those super fast connections fast enough to affect their behaviour. So unless your name's Maisie and you're living in Edinburgh, it's probably you. It's definitely me that has those super fast connections that impinge upon my decisions and on my behaviour. But here's the problem. We all think we're Maisie. We all think we're the one who hasn't got any biases. But in fact, the research, certainly Emily Prone and her team, she talks about this as a bias blind spot. We can't see our own biases. I can see your biases, you can see my biases, but we really struggle to see our own biases. The final thing to say, by the way, is that Dugard and Thomas Hunt at the end of 2015 gave us a word of warning. They said, no, I've told you it's everybody. No, I've told you that without these super fast connections, you couldn't live your life, and they're really, really useful. Now I've told you it's anthropologically hardwired into our brains. People can sometimes say, well, one of two things. Either, oh, that's a get out of jail free card. It's not me, it's my neurology that causes it. Or they can just say, well, let's just go with the flow, let's just do what the brain wants it to do. And I've got no problem with either position there, provided you never want to make another decision about people again. But we do, don't we? In work, we make decisions about who we work with, who we don't work with, who we help, who we don't help, who we give advice to, who we share information with, who we withhold information. If we've got a managerial position, who we recruit, who we allocate work to, who we promote. All those decisions are critical. I'm with the police again next week. Who do we shoot? Who do we not shoot? Who do we taser? Who do we not taser? They're fairly important decisions, aren't they? And when we have to have some personal responsibility for reining them in. Final thing to say about them, by the way, is they're more easily triggered under particular circumstances. When I place you under cognitive load, so I make you busy, I rush you for a decision, I give you complex layers of competing information, or I make you emotionally loaded. I make you stressed, angry, anxious, frustrated. This probably sounds a little bit like your workplace. We create these kind of work conditions for people by putting them under pressure. And the final, we do have some bias defense mechanisms in the brain sitting between the two hemispheres. They're called von Neumann neurons or spindle cells. They do a decent job of diffracting the waves that come from the amygdala, but not if we are depleted of glucose. They are dependent upon glucose to work. We know that within about 10 minutes of drinking a sugary drink, if we've lost control of our biases, we can get some control back. We start to be able to control them again. So keep the glucose levels up. And it's the same with tiredness, by the way. Once we get depleted, we start to get unenergetic. There is a risk that we fall back onto our big ping pong ball, our unconscious, from making all of these routine decisions. So if you've got important, difficult decisions to take, perhaps 4:30 on a Thursday when it's been a really hard week and people have been shouting at you and you've missed your lunch is probably not the best time to be making that decision. So I'm going to go to the polling again for you now. I want you to tell me, we've got a limited amount of time and lots of material. So what I want to do is I want to ask you, where would you like me to spend the time? So we'll cover all these areas, but it's just a question of which of these areas interest you most, and then we'll spend the time looking at the areas that perhaps interest you most. And I've given you a number of choices there. So obviously there's a kind of focus on recruiting today to a degree. Interviews is all part and parcel of that, but obviously we use interviews in a number of guises, don't we? The way we allocate work and put together teams, the way we do performance management, a promotion, the way we reward people, how we give feedback, and finally, what about our informal coaching and mentoring relationship? So vote away, and then I'll focus the time on the things that probably interest you more. I'm always slightly worried when I'm on this with the police because stop search is on the list and there's actually not a massive amount of research. Okay, a couple of more votes, get us up to sort of 3/4, and then I'll end the polling. Okay, I'll end the polling then. So it looks, and it's like a surprise, is it's recruiting, interviewing, performance management, a little less interest in other areas, but I'll touch on if I may. So let's get past that slide. So let me start with recruiting then. So it all starts in Sheffield in 2009. The Department of Work and Pensions area got together. They convened an expert panel, job centre managers with convened a panel, and they trawled the internet and found 1,000 real jobs across every large city in the UK. The panel clubs all the van drivers over here, the IT technicians over there, and then they drew up 3 CVs in application for that job. The quality of those 3 CVs in. Here's the clever bit. Top of the first one, white British name. Top of the second one, Asian name. Top of the third one, black African name. Crossover design, so each employer gets a 3 names. Then they sit and they wait for the phone to ring, the email to go ping, or the letterbox to click, and an invitation to be for interview to be offered. What they find is this: put a white British name on your CV, you wait an average of 9 applications before you get a call for interview. Put an Asian or an African name on exactly the same CV, so the only thing they've varied is the name. You'll wait 15 or 16 applications before you get that same call for interview. Colloquially known as the Sheffield study, it's been replicated around the world. The master of them is in Sweden, Dan Olaf Roof, and he's done the same: Swedish name, Arab Muslim name. They deselect disproportionately the Arab Muslims. He's put photographs on the CVs, which is still very common in Scandinavia, and he's made some of the people look overweight. They disproportionately deselect the overweight candidates compared to the slim candidates. It's been repeated around the world. The 2016, 43 of those studies over a period were reported. The same things happen wherever you go in the world. The dominant, powerful groups stand at the front of the queue. It came to a head last year with another one of those studies in the UK, because people say, well, yeah, that was 10 years ago. Things have changed since then. So 2019, it was repeated. This time, the sample's 3 times as large, and this time they're looking at specific names. So we know Asian and African names tend to suffer a detriment. Are the particular Asian and African names that suffer the most detriment? This is what they find. So majority group, that's the white folks, yeah. So we've got about a 1 in 4, 1 in 5 chance as a white person, slightly better for women than men if you apply with the CV. Look what happens when you put a Pakistani or a Nigerian name on exactly the same CV. All of a sudden, we're down in the worst case scenario there. It's about 1 in 9 chance for Nigeria upon and making this decision. So it's not a surprise that recruiters are now saying, well, perhaps we ought to take the names off CVs where we can. I do some please for when the application forms arrive for my assessor team to look at. All the names are gone. No names, no addresses, no dates of birth. Everything that's irrelevant to the application has been stripped off so that my assessors can have a clean look, if you like, at the application form. We also, by the way, we quality assure borderlines because we know if there is some bias to be had, it's probably going to come in the borderline candidates because we know ambiguity is one of those things that tends to allow our biases to re-emerge. So if we've got those borderline candidates, everybody can see a good CV, everybody can see a bad CV. It's those borderline candidates where we don't dimension to it, by the way, but it's an important study, I think, because of the sample size, and it's showing in actual fact it varies. All of the groups, by the way, is Indian Chinese groups in the main, so they don't do as well as the white less skilled occupations, which is something the Sheffield study saw as well. In higher skilled occupations, the effect tends to be slightly muted. So I won't bore you with all this in detail. The thing I'm really interested in is this idea. You probably heard the phrase intersectionality. So sometimes it's not just about being male, female, black, white. It's about a combination. And this study is American based. Is in postdoctoral science positions. And what they found basically, there was sometimes, especially in certain subjects, there was an interaction effect. So sometimes having two conditions, for example, being both black and female, could lead to the detriment. So it's not just a question of saying, well, it's all about black people, white people, or male, women. Sometimes you get two of the name on the application that varied. A little bit on promotion, and there's actually not a lot in the literature on promotion. What they do tell us is that the attitude of the promotion panel can predict the likely outcome. So when they interviewed promotion panels about their attitudes towards, in this case, gender, so were women facing particular barriers, were there things that needed to be done around gender? Organisations who said, well, you know what, I think we cracked it. I think, you know, women, if they put themselves forward, get a fair opportunity, compared to the ones who said, you know what, I think we do have barriers to promotion for women in this organisation that we need to address. When they revisited those panels 12 months later, what they found was the panels who'd adopted the second attitude, which is, you know, let's look at these barriers, they had made a much more equitable promotion in terms of their promotion decisions over the previous 12 months. And the panel who still had this attitude of, well, there are no problems here, it's been sorted, had tended then to disproportionately select men into those promotion positions. So the attitude of the promotion panel appears to predict the outcome. There was a bit of work recently, by the way, on body weight, suggesting body weight is one of the things that will not get you promoted. So don't go to the promotion panel with carrying additional body weight. And I'll touch upon body weight before we finish. A little bit on reward then. So another one of those comparative CV studies where they send two CVs. On this occasion, it was male and female, and it was for a job in a technical role as a lab manager. But the final question they asked was this one: based upon this CV, what would you recommend we offer as a starting salary? Now, don't shoot me for the scaling on this. It was Corinne Moss-Rakusin scaling. I just stole it from her document. But this is the recommended starting salary. Bear in mind, it's exactly the same CV. All they've done is change the name at the top of the CV. This is what she got. So a male CV is offered a little over 30,000 as a starting salary. A female, exactly the same CV, just with a female name, is offered a little under 26,500. I think if you're looking for your gender pay gap, it's sat right here. A little bit on language, and this relates to performance management, by the way. If you've not come across it, there's a piece of software called Textio. You have to pay for it. It's known as a gender decoder, and they've got a version. You can get them, by the way. If you Google gender decoder, they will pop up on the Google search. I can only speak for the efficacy of the Textio one because I've read the literature on that. I know how it was developed. So they put about 40,000 performance appraisals into a piece of artificial intelligence, told it whether it was male or female, and then asked it to identify the patterns in the language that were used around men and women at appraisal time. And you can see that women are 2.5 times more likely to be said they have an aggressive communication style. So a woman can be aggressive, the same behavior a man might be viewed as assertive. Women are 2.5 times likely to have references in their appraisal made to team accomplishments, only half as likely to have references to having vision, only half as likely to have references made to their technical expertise, and only 1/3 as likely to have their feedback linked to the business outcome. So, if we're using performance appraisal as a method for making decisions, whether it's reward or otherwise, it's probably not the best. But if you're interested, these gender decoders now could be used for all sorts of purposes. I've actually put entire competency frameworks into it. I've put advertisements, because it's mainly advertisements that it's designed for, by the way, these gender decoders. You can put your job advertisement into it. You can put your job descriptions into it, and it will highlight all the phrases and terms that tend to be used more about men than women. Why is this important? Because what we find is that typically if we use a gendered application, we attract 42% less applicants, or rather we get 42% more by using a neutral language than we use if we use gendered language. And then we shouldn't be surprised if we've used gendered language, if we end up with managers then recruiting the people who match the language, because they've already got the wiring in their head. They've already got the wiring between lab managers and men in their head. If we use the language, we're likely to end up. And I thought it was interesting. I found it recently, it's actually going back a few years. This was to do with references. And there are certain words that tend to get used a lot more about men than women, referred to as standout words. So men are more likely to be spoken about as excellent, exceptional, magnificent. I've never seen an appraisal or a reference with magnificent in myself, but then we go supreme, unmatched. There are differences in the way that we describe, and you can actually use the gender decoder in your appraisals in whichever way you want to start to pick out the language that might be causing problems. You can't always get rid of it, but what you can do is look for perhaps alternative words. And certainly most people spend about 8 seconds reading a job ad, and often if you can get words that chime with the groups to which they belong early on, you then tend to attract those individuals in for recruitment. But we end up with it also in the performance frameworks as well if we're not careful. A little bit about listening and expertise. I get this because I guess it cuts right across the HR process, whether it's meetings, appraisals, or anything else. Often, there's a little story that goes with this actually. I was with a group of women and I said to them, have you ever had an idea or put forward a suggestion in a meeting that's been ignored or shot down in flames? Then 10 minutes later, a man has said pretty much the same thing. And everybody now thinks it's a fantastic idea and it gets support. And the women had all had that experience. And in fact, they were a group of 13, and the one man in the corner put his hand up and said, you 12 do this to me all the time. You cut across me, you interrupt me, you steal my ideas. It's not what men do to women, it's what the dominant, powerful group to do to the less dominant, less powerful group. But men are usually the dominant, powerful group, and therefore they tend to be the ones that do it. But this particular study says even when we have an expert in the room, we tend to listen to the extroverted person as opposed to the expert some of the time. And in actual fact, the amount of airtime that people have is often a best predictor of their perceived influence rather than their actual expertise. So that tells us a lot about how to control the conversation, for example, in an interview wash-up panel, to make sure that we don't let certain people talk their candidate into the job or into the promotion. Okay, I've talked about performance management. We're more likely to allocate work to people like us. We see them as a safe pair of hands. We're more comfortable giving feedback, honest and open feedback to people like us because we think it's predictable. And finally, we're more likely to informally coach, mentor and support people like us. The things we have in common, we cycle at weekends, we went to the same university, starts a conversation that leads us to find out stuff about people, which we then use to help and support and advise and even speak up for them. So let me talk a little bit about, very briefly about bias testing, then I need to move on to talk about what we can do about it. So this is a bias test we've been administering for some while. So it's to do with the ethnicity bias. So this is the proportion of staff in each sector that appear to have an ethnicity bias strong enough to affect their behaviour. So although some sectors like the police tend to get a lot of focus on things like this. And you can see about 19%, 1 in 5 cops have got a ethnicity bias strong enough to affect their behaviour. We're not interested in people who lean this way or that. We've consistently seen fairly high levels of ethnicity bias. Academia was a bit of a surprise, but their bias does tend to be a little bit more mixed than the law sector. So academics can sometimes have a bias in favour of black minority ethnic groups, even though they themselves are white, I have to say. But you can see the kind of comparative data that we've got. And if you run a line across the centre, it's about 1 in 5 people have ethnicity bias strong enough to affect their behaviour. So what can we do about it? I'll have to skip past the fun bit, by the way. I was going to talk about height and body height. So basically, height seems to be a predictor of how much you earn. So the more height you have, the more money people tend to earn. Body weight seems to be the opposite. The fatter you are, the less money you earn. Beards seem to be a detriment. If you've got a beard, it tends to be seen as less competence, as cool as beards might be at this moment in time. If you're up for it as a website, in fact, it's an app on Amazon now. It's called Anaface, anaface.com. You can upload your photograph. It will give an index of 1 to 10 on how physically attractive you are. It's not for the faint-hearted. I'll give you a fair warning before you go there. It's a serious academic website started it off. They uploaded the photograph of recently appointed chief execs. The share price of companies led by attractive chief execs rises faster than the share price led by less attractive chief execs. We like to recommend, this is an interesting one actually, so men given a woman's CV and asked to see how likely they would be to recommend her for promotion or appointment in their business. The best predictor whether a man will recommend a woman for promotion or appointment is the number of hours that his own wife works outside the house. So the more hours his wife works outside the house, the more likely is to recommend a woman in the workplace. So the first one is, if we're going to get on top of this, we should be trying to review the assessment criteria. So you can use a gender decoder if you want to, but you can look through, looking for both the words that are used, but also any kind of assessment criteria. And I saw a D&I person the other day actually wanting a 2-1 in a science space, so put that in to a diversity and inclusion role. Try to extend, and obviously there's a focus here on recruiting, but try to extend the advertisement to try and be as proactive as we can in the way that we do that. So join in LinkedIn groups so that we can put the advertisement in the front of a more broad and diverse candidate pool. Hold the agency to account. So ask them, have they done any unconscious bias training? Have they tested their staff? What efforts have they made to reduce the bias in the work they do? Otherwise, you're buying in the biases of the organization. Shortlist. They bring a different perspective, but also in terms of things like interview panels for recruiting, people, in fact, it turns out it's something to do with the candidate. I've already talked about not overloading assessors or making them rush. Making sure we structure those conversations so we don't end up in a position of the bandwagon starting to roll where particular candidates and the extroverts dominate the conversation. Sometimes it's a good way to come up with a way of avoiding that kind of conversation. A built-in challenge, having somebody to say, you know what, are we sure about that? Having somebody to speak out along the way. Importantly, monitor the data. So make sure you know what the situation is with, I'm just trying to clear my my bar off the bottom, by the way, because it's getting in the way of my my bottom line. So monitor the data, know what the problem is and get on and fix it. And finally, be brave. This is not going to be fixed. All the Black Lives Matter stuff we've got going at the moment, it's not going to be fixed by doing the same old, same old. It's going to require some different thinking. And as I say, the personal actions are on the back of the card. The one that sticks out by the way, for me, are numbers 2 and 3, which are have contact. So try and create opportunity for contact and use role models. Remind yourself of people who've really impressed you. Those are the 2 that seem to have the biggest effect, but there are 9 on the list. Final thing to say is this. This is not unchangeable. This is not fixed in stone. Trish's work suggests that an hour of unconscious bias training, and we've done 50 minutes at least, an hour of unconscious bias training coupled with some bias testing, so that will be coming out in the link, and some basic cognitive strategies on things that you can do over a 12-week period. She saw a downward track in people's bias test scores when compared to a group of people who had the bias testing but had not had the input on implicit bias and had not been asked to carry through these basic, simple strategies. So with that, I will say thank you very much for your time. I'm conscious of the fact we're up against it time-wise now, but I'll go to the Q&A.